Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to be here today with none other than Professor Timothy Noakes. You all know him. Hello and welcome, Prof Noakes.
Hi, Tamsin. Great to be here. Love this new screening procedure that we're using.
Yes, it's
The
awesome. It
streaming
looks great.
program. It really makes a big difference.
It does. It's really, really awesome. So, Prof, we're here today to talk about one of your favorite topics, being an exercise scientist and a professor in exercise science for many years. Today, we're talking about exercise for the prevention and treatment of disease, which is the title of the Nutrition Network's latest training that is launching at the end of this month. But you do two really fascinating lectures for this training. The one that we're going to be focusing on today is dietary advice for athletes adapted to low carbohydrate diets. But the truth be told, I think that's almost a misnomer of a name for your lecture. It's really more of a lecture on, unsurprisingly, I suppose, debunking all strongly held beliefs about carbohydrates in exercise. And I'm going to give a little bit of a kind of spoiler alert to all of you watching today. You're going to think, oh, this is Prof Noakes we have talking here today. So he's going to tell us that we must never eat carbohydrates, right? Well, I think you might be in for a surprise there. Okay, guys. So I'm just letting you know that. Please carry on watching, because I think Prof Noakes is going to say something that's going to surprise you today, but maybe for reasons that are surprising as well. So definitely one to watch. Okay, Prof, before we dive in, I just want to do a brief introduction, both to you, not that you need any introduction, but just to get the formalities out of the way. And then also an introduction to the training, which is where people can go and find your full lectures on this crazy challenging of exercise and carbohydrate beliefs that you're doing, as well as, you know, one of my favorite lectures of yours, which is regarding mental fortitude and how the brain controls our ability to perform, which is really important. And I'll tell an anecdote about what happened to me after I listened to that lecture of yours. So I think everyone might find it really interesting. I pushed myself beyond anything I'd ever known I could ever do when it comes to exercise, because I'm a little bit of a weekend, well, not even warrior. I think that would be pushing it too hard to even call myself a weekend warrior, but we'll go into that as well. Okay, so my name is Tamsin Murphy. I'm a registered dietitian with expertise and interest in low carbohydrate, keto, therapeutic carbohydrate restricted diets. And we have Prof Tim Noakes here, who studied at the University of Cape Town to become a medical doctor, and then go on to become an exercise scientist, writer, researcher, professor. He is now currently an adjunct professor at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, following his retirement from the research unit of exercise science and sport medicine. So here we have you retire from professorship only to become a professor somewhere else. And Prof Noakes co-founded the now very prestigious Exercise Science Sports Science Institute of South Africa. He's been rated an A1 scientist by the National Research Foundation of South Africa, the NRF, for a third 5-year term. He has published more than 750 scientific books and articles. He's been cited more than 20,000 times in scientific literature and has an H index of 77, which is very impressive. He's won numerous awards, served on numerous boards, and you might know him by his best-selling book, The Real Meal Revolution, amongst many of his other books. He also founded the Noakes Foundation, which focuses on raising funding to support high-quality research in the area of carbohydrate restriction, but also in challenging science and good science. He is also the co-founder and chief medical director of Nutrition Network, where we train practitioners to be able to give therapeutic carbohydrate restriction advice for the treatment of various conditions, as well as yes, many other things. So that's a short summary of Prof Tim Noakes. So welcome, Prof Tim Noakes.
Thank you, Tamsin. Great to be with you, and looking forward to the next hour.
Yes,
I know that you will drive me and get to the base of what we're trying to discuss in a way that very few people can do. So
Oh, thank you. I certainly
Thank
hope
you.
so. It's a very, very exciting topic, so I'm really excited to dive into it. But before I do, I have to tell you about this training. All right, this exercise for the prevention of treatment and disease, which is coming out at the end of this month. And if you sign up now, before it comes out, before it launches on the 30th of October, you can get 20% off. So it's a really great opportunity to sign up now. I don't want to say it's the best of our trainings, but it's certainly an amazing, amazing training. And unlike our previous sports training, which many of you will have already taken, which is focused on athletes, this training, what makes it so unique is it is about preventing and treating disease. So it's not necessarily about the best performance you can have on the athletics field or in a certain sport, but it's more about using exercise and physical movement in your average person, in the client in front of you, in your own self, to achieve optimal health. Because yes, health is our birthright and nutrition is key to that, but exercise is really, really important too. Humans were made to move. And so this training basically teaches you about the foundational concepts of exercise and cardiorespiratory fitness and movement competency, and how you can build towards creating a personalized exercise prescription for the client in front of you, and combine that with your medical management or your nutritional management, and consider like the diverse populations and who is in front of you, using obviously evidence-based strategies. Practical case studies are included in the training. It's interactive learning. You're given tools. You learn to know kind of how to assess the patient in front of you, and then when to refer and who to refer to, so that you can really elevate your practice to not just be a medicine practice or not just be a nutrition practice. Let's say you're a dietitian, but to also incorporate one of the key tenets to human health, which is physical movement. So please sign up to this really important training, which launches on the 30th of October. All right, now we can dive in, Prof. Here we get into the meat of the debate. The pun was intended there. Okay. So, Prof, let's start. And this we are going to kind of start from a perspective of an athlete, right? So yes, the training is focused more on your average person who wants to be moving for health. And I think this does apply to them. But let's start on a bit of a higher level, and let's talk about people who exercise for long durations, more than an hour, more than 90 minutes. And, so these would be called the athletes, or even the weekend warriors. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry these days are doing half marathons. Now, they've been told to carboload, right? To get the storage form of glucose in your muscle called glycogen to maximize those stores, get those stores really saturated so that they have something to draw on when they're exercising. Because without this carbohydrate, when you're trying to push yourself to high levels of performance, which they call above 65% of VO2 max or beyond, then, the wisdom goes, let's call it, or the idea is that you then have to start relying more on carbohydrate for this really fast bursts of power and energy and exercise. And also within the first, hour to 90 minutes, you're going to run out of a lot of carbs. You're going to have to keep getting that glycogen store filled up. And otherwise you're going to, what the Americans call bonk, right? You're going to hit a wall, as we say here in South Africa, and you're going to have to stop exercising. And that's the last thing someone who's trying to run a marathon, a half marathon, or even is going to want to do. Now, Prof, you are saying that no, we've got it totally wrong since the late 60s, when we discovered that carbohydrates are needed for optimal performance and preventing fatigue. That not entirely no, but let's say no, glycogen, this muscle storage form of carbohydrate, isn't what's required for preventing fatigue and optimizing performance. Well, if it's not, Prof, what we want to find out from you is what is, Prof?
Thank you, Tamsin. What people need to know is they need to be in the business for a long time to see the whole picture, because things change and ideas change. And then you have to analyze, was it really true that we should have changed? And I think that's the issue.
So, Prof,
we
So,
started
Prof,
sports science in South Africa in 1981. And the very first thing we wanted to do, because we could draw blood samples, we could weigh people, and we could see how much they drank during exercise, and we could measure their rectal temperature. So that's what we started with. And the very first study we ever did was we went to the Comrades Marathon in 1981, and we measured blood glucose levels in the finishers. So that's how long I've been in the field for, since 1981. And in fact, what we found, we wrote up as a letter to the New England Journal of Medicine, which is quite an erudite journal. And we were contesting what some people had said, that if your blood glucose level fell during exercise, it didn't matter. But we'd clearly seen that it did matter, because some of the Comrades runners were in terrible shape. And there's when you go back in the history, they'd say that after one particular Boston Marathon, the very first one that was studied in the 1920s, one guy was sent to jail because he was supposedly drunk, but his blood glucose was so level, he was abusive to the police.
oh,
And they sent him
wow.
to jail. And only then did they realize that he was not drunk any alcohol. He was just had a low blood glucose level.
Oh my gosh.
So the real story begins in about 1939, when a guy called Boye, who's working in a laboratory in Copenhagen, and exercise science really begins in those laboratories. They were way ahead of the field, astonishingly good researchers. And what he did was he exercised as long as he could, and then he found that his blood sugar level fell. And if he took sugar, he felt much better, and he could continue for another hour. Then the people who were in charge of him, Christensen and Hansen, they also decided they would study him, and they published their paper with him as the subject. And they found exactly the same, that when they gave glucose during exercise, the athlete's performance improved. But they were measuring metabolism at the same time, and that was the key. Because what they noticed was all the glucose did when you ingested it was to raise your blood glucose level. And if you didn't raise the blood glucose level, nothing happened. The person didn't feel better and couldn't continue. But when you raise the blood glucose level, their metabolism did not change. They didn't burn more carbohydrate or fat. They just raised the blood glucose. And so then Christensen and Hansen published in 1939 a paper which no one read because it was in German. So if you read the literature, it says Christensen and Hansen showed that carbohydrate ingestion during exercise improves performance. So therefore, any carbohydrate is always going to work, either whether you take it before or during exercise. I got two great friends of mine to translate it. And there they said that what happens is if your blood glucose level drops, the brain stops you exercising. So they were onto the central governor model already. And that's what they described. And they said that there's a hypoglycemia, which the brain affects the brain, and the brain protects itself by slowing you down.
So
Prof,
they say that I'm going to interrupt you just there, if you don't mind, just to summarize this, because I think it's quite complicated. If you haven't watched and rewatched your lecture like I have, so I'm gonna summarize it in the way I understand it, which is that you're saying that these Scandinavians, way back before we could measure glycogen in the muscle,
that's it,
that they measured blood glucose, your blood sugar levels, and they found that when people had low blood sugar, they got tired and needed to stop exercising. And when their blood sugar level during exercise was maintained by ingesting carbohydrate during exercise, so their blood sugar that didn't drop, they were able to carry on performing as they should. And so they concluded that if you ingest carbohydrate during prolonged exercise, it maintains your blood sugar level, your blood glucose level, thereby allowing you to carry on exercising. And they said that that's likely due to the provision of that sugar to your brain, or that glucose to your brain, rather than to your muscle, because they measured something called the respiratory quotient, which allows you to see how much the muscle is relying on carbohydrates for energy and how much the muscle is relying on fat for energy. And from that, they saw that even though they were feeding people carbs, the muscle wasn't using more carbs. So that higher blood sugar wasn't affecting the muscle carbs at all. It was affecting the carbs to somewhere else. And the logical conclusion would be that somewhere else would be the brain, right? So that's what you're saying in a nutshell,
That's
if I
correct.
understand it. Okay. So then you can
So
take us from the journey from there, Prof.
Okay, so what happens next is the World War comes along, the Second World War, and research in exercise science just disappears for many years. And the next thing that happens is 1967, along this, in the same laboratories, but sorry, not in Sweden, because Copenhagen, the guys from Copenhagen eventually went to Sweden, and there they started sports science in Sweden, in Stockholm. And two of them developed or used a technique called the muscle biopsy technique, which they could measure glycogen in the muscle, i.e. the carbohydrate in the muscle. So remember, as you said, we were measuring glucose in the bloodstream, very simple, just draw a blood sample. This is a bit more invasive, and so it's not done as routinely. So they then set up a study, and it's really important. I discovered, it's funny, I've read that paper 1,000 times. And every time you pick up a little thing more. So they took 9 physical education graduates with mediocre exercise performance. But if you read the textbooks, they say these were elite athletes being studied by these elite scientists, and they were not. They were just physical education graduates. And the point I make with that is because when we study ordinary athletes and we find the opposite, then they say it's because you're not studying the proper athletes like the elite athletes studied in Stockholm in 1967. Well, they weren't elite athletes. They were just exactly the same as the athletes we study. Okay. So what they do is they give these athletes 3 different diets, and then they have them exercise, or either a high carbohydrate diet, where they took in, I think, about 400 to 500 grams of carbohydrate a day. Then a higher protein, they call it a higher protein fat diet, which was a lower moderate diet. And then they had the low carbohydrate diet. And the low carbohydrate diet, again, off the record, was about 50 grams. So they went from quite high to quite low. And what they noticed was that on the high carbohydrate diet, these athletes could exercise. They had much more muscle glycogen when they started, and they could exercise for much longer. But when they're on the low carbohydrate diet, they started with much lower muscle glycogen, and they couldn't exercise anywhere near as long. And then they plotted this lovely graph showing that the more glycogen you had at the start, the longer you could exercise. And that was it. Game over.
Did they tell us about blood glucose, Prof?
Yeah. Okay. So it's game over because now they've shown glycogen. And so when I wrote Law of Running, there it was. There's that graph. The more glycogen in the muscle, the longer you can exercise. So it took me till 2022, probably 2021, when I went back to that paper. And I've shown this graph hundreds of times in lectures. And I'd ignored the panel at the bottom. So the panel at the top was the panel at the top was the glycogen use during exercise. And the panel at the bottom was the blood glucose levels. And we just ignored it like they did. And it showed that they'd all become hypoglycemic, significantly hypoglycemic. So what should have happened in 1967 was that these authors should have said, well, we've got 2 problems here. We've got a low glycogen in the muscle, and we've got a low blood glucose. And we know Christensen and Hansen said that a low blood glucose is a problem. So therefore, we can't say if it's muscle glycogen or blood glucose that is the problem. We need to do other experiments. But they didn't. They said, we found this lovely straight line association. Therefore, we know that it's muscle glycogen and we can ignore blood glucose. And that's what they did. They actually mention in the paper the blood glucose was low, but they just leave it at that. So then everyone comes along, and this is fantastic because now we've got the key to exercise performance is muscle glycogen. So sports nutrition takes off as promoting high carbs. And we as exercise physiologists, all we do is measure muscle glycogen as often as we can. And we just repeat the same experiments and we come to the same conclusions. And that's because we're working from a model. And the model is that muscle glycogen is critical. But science is not, that's not science. Science is to disprove. So you should disprove the model. And it took us till 2019 until we decided we would disprove the model, or we would test whether the model was true. And then
how did you do
we
that,
did the
Prof?
other experiments we can talk about.
Yeah. So how did you do it? How did you disprove that? Or I'm assuming you did disprove it.
Okay, so what happened was Philip Prince is this Cape Townian who's went to America on a scholarship, an athletic scholarship, and settled in America, runs a fantastic laboratory in Pennsylvania at a small college, Grove City College. And he has this fabulous laboratory and his fabulous subjects. And when he tells them you're going to eat a high-fat diet for the next 42 days, they do it. And they religiously follow it. And we know that because we measure them while they're on the trials, and they stick to it religiously. So he said, what should we do? I said, well, let's have a 5K time trial first. And the beauty of laboratory time trials is they're very repeatable within a few seconds. So if a guy runs 15 minutes for 5Ks, we wouldn't have athletes that good. If he runs 20 minutes for 5Ks, he'll repeat it. It'll be 20, 10, 25, whatever. It will be very close. And so we then showed that the times for completion were identical on a high carb or a high fat diet. So that was completely unexpected. We weren't the first to show it, but everyone else who's shown it has been completely written out of history. There are at least 2 other studies showing carb loading with a randomized control trial had no effect on performance, but they're hidden. And there was one of them went out to like 30 kilometers. They had people run, these are New Zealand group. In fact, I think they ran even further than 30 kilometers on a treadmill, which is unbelievably difficult. And they found no effect of a high carbohydrate diet, but it's hidden from history. So anyway, so we did that. Then I said, the problem is what they're going to say is that, yes, because they had enough glycogen in their muscles. So or it was too low intensity exercise. So I said, let's go to a high intensity. So we did a mile repetition trial. We found exactly the same, no benefit. And then, but at the end of that trial, we also did 6 times 800 meter repetitions because we specifically wanted to lower the glycogen in the muscles. And we predicted if they're on a high fat diet and they do 6 times 800 meters, by the 6th one, they'll just collapse on the treadmill. They won't be able to run. Surprise, surprise, their performance was identical. It was completely unchanged. So that proved then that the carbohydrate content really wasn't making much difference, even during high intensity exercise. Fortunately, we also measured their fat oxidation and carbohydrate oxidation during that 1 mile race. Sorry, during the 6 times 800 meters. And we found the highest rates of fat oxidation ever measured in humans in history. And why is that important? Because they were running at 86% of their maximum. The textbook, any textbook on exercise science shows this fabulous graph like that. And it goes up, you burn more fat as you exercise more intensively. And then it comes to naught. At 85% of your maximum, you burn 0 fat. And we found these incredibly high rates of fat oxidation. And so therefore, we disproved a couple of things. Most importantly, that you can burn fat at high exercise intensity. So invite anyone to go and pick up a textbook of exercise science and see what it says about fat oxidation at high intensity. It says you can't burn fat at high intensity exercise.
I mean, it's even on those gym machines, Prof, right? I mean, if you go to gym and you step onto an orbital trainer or any other machine, it's going to tell you you're in the fat burning zone when you're at VO2 max, I don't know, 65%, but you're out of the fat burning zone as soon as you're over 80, definitely. Whereas what you're saying is that actually fat oxidation, which is fat burning, happens at an incredibly high, or can happen at an incredibly high rate, even when you are pushing yourself to such a big degree. Whereas we thought there should be no fat burning capable of happening at that level. But this was in fat adapted athletes, right? This is in people who are habituated to eating high fat, low carbohydrate diet. And when they push themselves to that extent, they're still burning really high rates of fat, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And so that That overthrew 100 years of teaching in exercise science. Was
Prof,
it difficult to do?
Is that the same for carbohydrate habituated athletes? So let's say you're in a carb loading, carb reliant kind of athlete. When they push themselves to 80% VO2 max, are they also actually burning fat at that rate or not?
No, they'd have to be carbohydrate depleted when they start. So
Okay.
it turns out that muscle glycogen is the regulator of what you burn during exercise. And if you start with lots of glycogen in the muscles, you'll burn glycogen predominantly. If you start with little glycogen in the muscles, you'll burn fat. And so that's, and again, that's really interesting because on all the talk shows and discussions and Zooms and podcasts, they say, if you want to burn more fat during exercise, you've got to train harder. It's not true. All you've got to do is just don't eat carbohydrates and you'll burn all the fat you can. So it seems to me that fat is the chosen fuel. It's not carbohydrate. Fat is the fuel that the body's designed to burn. But we destroy it by eating this high carbohydrate diet. And then we start exercise with lots of glycogen and we have high insulin and then we can't burn the fat.
But Prof,
that takes the story to where we disprove the fact that the muscle can't burn fat when it's exercising vigorously.
Before we move on, Can I ask a question, something I'm a little confused about? You say that you and Prince and your team showed that Carboloading made no difference to their performance output, right? Even high power, kind of high VO2 max performance output. But now what about those diets that Bergstrom put people on, which is, like you mentioned, was a 400 gram per day diet, which is quite a very high carb diet. And they performed better than the people who were on a keto diet. So why did they find different results to what you were finding?
Because firstly, they only put the athletes on the diet for 2 days. So there was no adaptation.
Okay.
And they started exercise with very low liver glycogen. That was the problem. So that they became hypoglycemic very quickly. Once you adapt to a high-fat diet, you must be changing your metabolism so that you can cope with a low blood glucose level if you have to, and you can generate enough glucose from other sources to keep your blood glucose elevated during exercise. So we now know it takes 4 to 5 weeks for that to happen. And you don't become hypoglycemic, or if you do become hypoglycemic, you can cope because of ketones and lactate and so on.
Okay,
so that's the reason. If you put anyone on for 2 days on a high-fat diet, they perform sometimes awfully. But give them a few weeks.
This seems to be a recurring theme from the studies I've looked at. I mean, the ones that find that low-carb diets are deleterious to performance generally put people onto it and then expect them to suddenly exercise after very little time to adapt. So it looks like they made the same mistake.
Yeah. It's really interesting that Steve Phinney was the first person to use a high-fat diet and study it in the laboratory. And the reason he did it was because he found a book in his father's library, which was a story of a particular person who went into the Canadian Arctic. They were searching for some people who were lost in a boat wreck, etc. The Franklin expedition, the very famous expedition where everyone died and the people wanted to find out what had happened. And he was an American who led a group to try and find these people. And eventually he went to live with the Inuits and he had to eat the Inuit diet. And he said for the first week, it was horrible. We couldn't exercise. But after 2 weeks, he said we could do anything. We could keep up with the Inuit, even though we were eating this high-fat diet. Wow. And so Steve Phinney realized that you could adapt to the high-fat diet. And no one up to that point had thought that it was possible. And then he did a very simple study and showed reasonable adaptations to the high-fat diet. But again, it took 4 to 5 weeks. We've got a study of marathon runners who've adapted to a high-fat diet currently ongoing. And it was very clear that it took 5 or 6 weeks before their performance normalized or improved. So you have to do 5 or 6 weeks. And what's happening now is because the evidence is coming out that you don't need carbohydrates, industry is funding any study they can possibly think of that will show that low carbs don't work. So they go to the scientists and they say, we'd like you to do a 2-day study of a high-fat diet because we know what the result will be. They don't say that.
Yeah.
They don't say we know it's going to produce a negative result, but that's what's happening.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's how industry works, unfortunately. So that's why we can expect a lot of studies, increasingly large number of studies, showing that 2 weeks or 1 week or 2 weeks of a high-fat diet is detrimental for performance.
Yeah. Well, Prof, well, again, it's always this industry meddling in our scientific studies and in our scientific knowledge. But Prof, I interrupted you just to kind of get an understanding of the difference between Bergstrom's high carb diet and then, your carbo loading diet with Prince. And you were about to go on to the next step of the story, which I think was leading us down the hypoglycemia, how you got to the hypoglycemia theory.
Okay, I got to the hypoglycemia by actually seeing that study by Bergstrom and showing the hypoglycemia was present. Okay. That made me start thinking that liver glycogen was perhaps more important than muscle glycogen. Okay. But anyway, we've now completed the first definitive study where we've compared muscle glycogen to blood glucose to determine which is the important one. And this paper, it was submitted, it's been reviewed. We had 3 unbelievably good reviews. I've never seen such fair reviews, and it stunned me because we thought we'll never get this paper published because it's too controversial.
Yeah.
But we had 3 incredibly honest reviewers who, I don't know who they are or where they come from. They took real effort and they wrote pages and pages and pages. Wow. And so we're currently correcting the article. So my presumption is that it will be published and then it will become quite an important paper. So anyway, what we did, we took our guys when they did the high carb diet or the high fat diet, and then we had them exercise to exhaustion, exactly as Bergstrom had done. But the difference was on both diets, they did 2 interventions. They had a placebo and they had carbohydrate. So you had them, the same athletes, same 10 athletes, high carbohydrate diet with placebo during the exercise test or with carbohydrate during the exercise test. And then conversely, they would then do the low carb diet and also do the placebo and the high carb. Now, the key was we gave them a tiny, tiny, tiny drop of glucose. Because by that time, we'd realized that if carbohydrate is beneficial by acting on the blood glucose, you only need a touch during exercise to keep your blood glucose normal.
How much, Prof? Are we talking like 5 grams? Are we talking 10 grams? Are we talking 15 grams? What are we talking?
We gave them 10 grams an hour. Now, if you go and look at the textbooks or the stories today, athletes are being encouraged to drink 120 grams an hour.
Wow.
And that's become now routine in the Tour de France. If you're not taking your 90 to 120 grams an hour, you're not going to perform, apparently. So we did that experiment. And so now let's compare the 2 groups when they start with high glycogen or low glycogen. So by the old model, and then they take placebo during exercise. So they're both taking placebo, but they start with quite different muscle glycogen. There was 0 difference in performance, not a second.
Wow.
No difference in performance. Then we took them again, and now we've got the high diet and the low diet, and we give them glucose, and they both improve their performance 16 to 20%. The 10 grams of glucose ingested during exercise produced a 15 to 20% improvement in performance, which 400 grams of carbohydrate a day for 6 weeks couldn't do. It couldn't do a thing to them. But just taking your 10 grams an hour during exercise, so there was about 20 grams because they all went about 2 hours, it made this huge difference. So we definitively proved that it's the glucose in the bloodstream that determines exercise performance by preventing hypoglycemia. Now, let me just make one very long point. All athletes get tired. and their if they're taking glucose, they still get tired when their blood glucose is normal. And that is the real type of fatigue in prolonged exercise, which is centrally regulated, and it's due to all sorts of other things. Glucose only works in the first couple of hours of exercise. And thereafter, as long as your glucose is fine, it's not going to make any difference whatsoever, because then there are other factors that come into play. And where we've made the huge error in the exercise sciences is always to say, well, we've got the magic solution. This is the magic solution. If you're going to do exercise for 2 or 3 hours and you think you can do it without carbs, you can't. You have to have some carbs during exercise. But what you do before exercise is immaterial. It's not going to make any difference to your performance.
Wow. So that's a soundbite right there, Prof. And you turned the entire exercise nutrition world on its head, really, because we've been told you've got a carb load. We've been told maximize your muscle glycogen. Your muscle glycogen storage capacity will determine your performance. Meanwhile, that's rubbish, it turns out. It turns out that actually it's your blood glucose, your blood sugar level, which can be controlled in relatively prolonged exercise for a few hours by just ensuring that you're giving your body about 2 teaspoons worth of carbs every hour. So, I mean, that's huge. That's huge, Prof. 2 teaspoons worth, you know, not 10, 20 teaspoons worth, you know. I think that's really, really, really important, Prof. Now, is this the case for it? Okay, let me package this question. The title of this talk today, this discussion today, and of your talk during the training is, let me go back and just repeat it properly, but dietary advice for athletes who are adapted to low carbohydrate, high fat diets. But my understanding from what you've just said is that this is dietary advice for athletes, full stop. It doesn't matter whether they are habituated to low carb, high fat diets or high carb, low fat diets. It's irrelevant according to your study with Prince. What you're saying
you're quite absolutely correct. The only difference is that if you're eating a high carb diet, you will start exercise with a little more glycogen. So you could probably get away with a little less glucose, or you could go 2 hours before you needed any glucose at all. That's the only difference.
Okay, so someone who's eating a normal diet, a high carb diet, if you will, they can maybe not take any carbs for the first 1 or 2 hours and then only start supplementing with their 10 grams of carbs an hour. Whereas the low carb, high fat athlete probably needs to start within the first hour if they want to optimize performance with their 10 grams of carbs.
Yeah, that would be the safest. I still probably the high fat diet is fine because you can burn ketones and you probably don't burn glucose quite as rapidly as you do if you're carbohydrate adapted. But what you've said is in essence correct.
So at which point then, Prof, what would your recommendations be to someone who is a fat adapted, low carb, high fat athlete? Would you say to them, exercise as long as you can before you start feeling rubbish and then take 10 grams of carbs? Or would you say just do the 10 grams of carbs after the first hour? Or
yeah, I think it's probably how competitive you are. And if you're competing in competition, I wouldn't wait. I'd take the 10 grams right from the word go.
And if you're training,
we do have athletes like Sean Saganowski who cycles 100 kilometers a day and never takes anything. So I think you can adapt. He's really well adapted. His liver is able to produce glucose from nothing. So he's fine. But I would advise people to measure their glucoses when they're exercising with a CGM, probably. If you really want to professionalize, measure your glucose and see what happens. And I think people will be astonished for how long they can exercise without taking any glucose once they become fat adapted.
What about your weekend warriors, Prof? Would you have a different recommendation for them? Would you say for someone who, who runs 5Ks, 10Ks once, twice, 3 times a week?
Yeah, you're not going to get into trouble in 10Ks. No.
Okay.
I think we're talking about 20Ks or longer. that
Okay. And then,
you probably do need some glucose.
well, that's good to know. Then Ian Gorner asked a really good question, which I was actually going to ask, which is, does the type of carb taken during exercise matter?
Yeah, we spent years studying that question, and we found that you could take starch or glucose that were absorbed and digested equally rapidly. So the digestion process occurs incredibly quickly, and therefore it doesn't matter how long the chain of glucose is. It gets broken down very quickly, and your body starts to use it. It makes no difference. Yeah, in fact, we made a big error and had to retract a paper because we thought that the starch was more rapidly digested. The problem was we were using a radioactive tracer which didn't trace the starch, and so therefore it gave us an overreading of how quickly the stuff was being used. But in proper studies where they tested starch, which was radioactively labeled, there's no difference between starch and glucose. So it really doesn't matter.
Okay, so people could be getting this from processed goos or energy drinks. I mean, you need a tiny amount, or where would
potato,
you?
Potato would be the same. They all break down very quickly.
Okay, so you take a bit of potato with you, and then you're sorted. What about things that contain sucrose, like fruit? Would you say, like, is a banana, now this contains fructose, so we're not talking glucose anymore. Would a banana be equally useful? Most bananas contain about 20 grams of carbs, but much of that's going to be fructose, and there's going to be a bit of fiber in there too.
Yeah, it probably will be, because it'll provide enough glucose or fructose converted to glucose. It probably would work just as well. What's interesting is that the highest rates of oxidation, if you come from mixtures of sucrose, glucose, and something else, I forget now, might be fructose, that if you really want rapid oxidation, so to get the muscles to use the stuff, which is different from what we're trying to achieve, then combinations of different carbohydrates work better. But to get your blood glucose, and just the 10 grams, you can use anything.
Okay, so
I wouldn't prescribe sucrose because I worry about sugar addictions and things like that. Okay. And that's what we're trying to get away from.
So that answers Michael Taylor's question, he's doing the Cape Town Marathon, and he doubts he's as fat adapted as Sean Sakonovsky, but he wants to know whether you would suggest a little bit of Coca-Cola every hour on his run. And it says he says he's a weekend warrior, and it's his first marathon. He also says that glucose goo has been suggested to him. You've just said you worry about sugar addiction. So my assumption is that you would say no to that. What would you suggest for someone like Michael?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, where's he going to get his carbohydrate? Unless he carries it with him, it's going to be in the Coca-Cola that's provided. And Coke has plenty more sugar than more glucose. In fact, I don't know whether it has high fructose corn syrup or what is it anymore, but it has more than enough carbohydrate. So a few sips of Coke would be fine. If you don't like the thought of Coca-Cola, then what we've suggested, just take some sachets of glucose with you, and that's all you need. 10 grams, weigh them out. Bruce Fordyce and I were the first to produce these sachets for leptin FRN, and if you go and check on the internet, you'll see that they were the first sachets, and they contain 25 grams, and we used to suggest you took 2 an hour, and we were a bit wrong. So the sachets, you only need half a sachet, and that would be fine. And I don't know what sachets are available at the moment, but you probably need half the amount that they're suggesting. And that would be a very easy way to do it.
Yeah, half the amount that they're suggesting, or potentially even up to a quarter of an amount. Because, Prof, when I learned about carbohydrate and exercise when I was studying, we learned 50 grams an hour, which is much like what you and Bruce Fordyce were suggesting in the form of your goos. You said 25 grams twice in an hour.
Yeah, that's right.
But now you're saying that they're recommending 100 to 120 grams in an hour, which is a lot more. So I think people would have to measure this out very carefully if they're going to use a glucose goo or something like that. Yeah. Okay. Well, this is really, really fascinating and completely turns everything on its head. Everything that we know or thought we knew about the importance of muscle glycogen in performance, in avoiding fatigue, the importance of blood glucose and maintaining blood glucose in avoiding fatigue, actually, and how a carbohydrate adapted athlete and even a non-carbohydrate adapted athlete can use this knowledge to appropriately supplement with exogenous or external carbohydrate during exercise. And thereby, actually, Prof, what you're doing is, through this research, I feel that you are saving people from the potential deleterious effect of over-consuming carbohydrates before exercise, which is a real problem, and then also over-consuming carbohydrates during exercise. I remember you once saying, you feel like a lot of the people you studied with back at university became sugar addicts because you were downing these sugary drinks and eating these sugary foods because you thought that it would help your performance. And that results in things like carbohydrate sugar addiction and eventually metabolic conditions like type 2 diabetes. So this is really, really, really important. So we don't end up with metabolically sick athletes, but we still optimize performance. So Prof, thank you again for your work, your huge, amazing work in this space. And I look forward to hearing more about the role of potentially ketones in maintaining one's ability to perform in the face of the lack of glucose, potentially, because you did say something which I think is really important, which is that potentially carbohydrate or fat adapted athletes can get away with lower blood glucose because they maybe are relying more on ketones, or because their liver glycogen is more optimized, or their ability for their liver to produce glucose is more optimized. I think there's a lot more there that you should study and let us know about in order to optimize performance.
Can I just butt in there because I've been writing this long review, which started with our textbook, and then I've taken it a bit further and have been working on it for 4 years. And we looked at a paper which was published a few months ago, which said you need 90 to 120 grams of carbs every hour to run a sub 2-hour marathon. So I went and looked at the data, and I'm the first person to see if you're ingesting carbohydrate 120 grams per hour, how much is actually digested and oxidized by the muscles. And guess what? It's only half of it. Half of it is ingested and the other half remains unused. So and it sits in the gut, or it goes to the liver and gives you fatty liver, etc. So while they're trying to force the muscle to burn more carbohydrate, the body's saying, no, we don't want all this carbohydrate. And their argument is that, it's limiting. You're limited a capacity to get this glucose into the bloodstream and burned by the muscle. No, it's regulated, because the body's not stupid. It doesn't want the blood glucose to go high. So it does everything it possibly can do to make sure the blood glucose doesn't rise too high. And it's going to store that glucose and get rid of it somehow, rather than allowing it to be used by the muscles. So someone now published a paper in the last week or two where this is what happens in research. The model is now we've got to maximize glucose oxidation by the muscles. So they said, but what if you're a big person or a small person? Maybe if you're a big person, you need more than if you're a small person. So this group at Liverpool University, John Moores University in Liverpool, which is a very, very fine university, does great research, but they're completely captured by this idea that glucose oxidation is important. So they study big people and small people. And again, they find that 50% of what they forced into these people is not oxidized. It's sitting there somewhere, and they never mention it. They completely ignore it. But as I'm reading this article, it looks at the nutrition of the subjects. These are phys ed subjects, probably phys ed students. Guess what their sugar intake every day is? And this is no one looks at it. 100 grams of sugar a day. That's not carbohydrate. That is sugar alone. Wow. And the people doing the research think 100 grams of sugar a day, there's nothing wrong with that. That is a disaster. I mean, that is diabetes in the making. And so if these premier researchers in carbohydrate oxidation during exercise don't understand that it's not right that people should ingest 100 grams of sugar a day, then we have a real problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is very, very important for the health of athletes. Michael has one more question, and if anyone else has questions, please, now's the time to do it. We have got less than 5 minutes left with Prof, and we didn't even get into the topic of his next lecture, which is the one that made me run like I have never run before. But we're not going to have time to cover it, and maybe I'll just give a brief anecdote on that. But Michael asks, should he take 10 grams of carbs before his marathon as well?
No, absolutely not. That can affect your insulin and affect your performance, or then you reduce your fat oxidation. No, you should only do it when you start exercising. After half an hour, you can have your first dose.
Perfect. Thank you, Prof. And then Wendy Moore says that she's a master's swimmer. She's been happily and successfully carnivore for 2 years. Her workout is 3 times a week for 1 to 1.5 hours, and she swims each practice at least 12 hours fasted. And she's fully fat adapted, eating only meats, eggs, and some fish. Should she take 10 grams of carbs of some sort for this duration of swim? So remember, it's 1 to 1.5 hours to maximize her workout performance. She does say she's a sugar addict.
Yeah, I doubt it, Wendy. I think you'll be fine without it. You could tell by measuring your glucose at the finish if you were concerned. If you have a glucose monitor, it would be easy. Just stop, but you must stop and measure it immediately.
So what would you say is too low,
your glucose rises. And as long as your glucose is close to the value you started with, that's all you need. What definitely happens is the brain doesn't wait for your glucose to drop far before it says, I'm worried. As soon as the glucose starts to drop, the brain anticipates and slows you down half an hour later. So it's an anticipatory response, and therefore you want to keep your glucose at the same value that you started with for the entire exercise.
And Prof,
so if you start exercise and your value is 5 and you finish and it's 4.9, that's fine. The sugar's not going to make any difference to your performance.
Now, some carnivores start with or spend a lot of their life in what a lot of people would consider relative hypoglycemia. For them, it seems to be normal. Is that level also the same would apply?
Yeah, the same would apply. You don't want your glucose to drop. That's the key. As long as even if it starts at 3.5 and it stays at 3.5, you're fine. But the moment it starts to drop, the brain anticipates there's a problem and will slow you down.
Now, Peter says, have you got any advice for chronic low sugar condition when it comes to training? Maybe there's underlying issues.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Peter. I would definitely put a CGM on, a continuous glucose monitor on, to see what's happening. If you've got a low glucose, the question is, does it get worse during exercise or not? If it doesn't, then it wouldn't worry me. But if it was dropping further and you were getting symptoms of hypoglycemia, that would certainly be a concern for me. But a low glucose is fantastic. we all wish we could have lower glucoses. So it just depends what level you're talking about. If it is a real problem, it means that your hormonal response is inappropriate and it's not raising your glucose as it should, because the body's got all these hormones to raise glucose and only one to drop it, and that's insulin. So if it's dropping and not rising, it means those hormones aren't working. And sure, there can be those conditions, but they would be potentially slightly dangerous because there may be times when you need to raise your blood glucose. But the fact that no doctor has caused concern or the patient hasn't been told that they must do X, Y, and Z suggests to me that it's a normal variant. It's not a pathological state.
Great. Thank you, Prof. So unfortunately, everybody, we've come to the end of our time and we didn't even get a chance to go into Prof's amazing lecture on mental fortitude. So maybe we're going to have to schedule another one for that, or you're just going to have to go and buy this training for the 20% off before the end of this month and actually listen to it yourself, because that one is the one that made me run like I never knew I could run from a relatively untrained state, because of the power of the mind. So yes, here we've been talking about the power of the mind under the influence of sufficient glucose, but Prof goes deeper than that to look at what people can do to overcome extreme challenges, what people can do to achieve success in any pursuit. He goes into the great psychologists of our time, such as Viktor Frankl, and looks into what their teachings mean for you, related to mental fortitude and suffering and actually achieving great things. And who better to learn about achieving great things than the great Prof Tim Noakes? So he also talks about some of, the rowing crews and rugby teams that he has worked with or read about, and what mental attitudes and aspects influence their success. So if you want to find out more about that, Prof, I'm not even going to let you talk because I think you have so much to say, but we don't have time for it now. People, please go and watch his lecture on this. This is amazing. And there are so many more amazing lecturers on this talking about cardiorespiratory fitness, how to achieve it, what kind of exercises to do, where the vagal nerve is involved, how do you activate that, goals, how important those are, that links to Prof's lectures. It's amazing. It's a really, really amazing training. So go out, get it, guide your patients so that they can achieve their birthright, which is their health, and exercise and move the way a human is supposed to move. Thank you all for your wonderful comments. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Jana. I've already said thank you to Peter, Ian, Michael. We also had the Primal Lifestyle on here. Wendy, thank you all for your involvement. And Prof, most importantly, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your expertise with all of us. And have a really good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you all are. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.